Wow, we have a very large turnout tonight. I'd like to welcome everybody to the OurCrowd investment webinar. These are part of a series that we call Teach-In Tuesdays. We do 2 webinars every month, both for investors in the startup space and the technology space, as well as other people who are interested in learning about startups, entrepreneurs, the whole kind of investment ecosystem as well. And a lot of times we do these events. I'm Zack Miller. I run the investor community here at OurCrowd. I'm a partner here. We do some of these internally, and a lot of times we reach out to experts in the field, like Ron Moritz, who's going to be presenting tonight, who's an expert on cybersecurity, to give investors and entrepreneurs alike kind of an overview of the field. We get a lot of good feedback that these are very useful. These are events for you guys, so any feedback you provide us is very useful in terms of our planning and our delivery. So if you have ideas for future webinars, or if you have any feedback on the webinar you'll see tonight, please feel free to give us that. Again, a few of you, when you signed up, asked if there would be a recording of the webinar. We will have a recording available that will probably go out to you tomorrow. We'll also be able to share the deck if Ron agrees to make it available, which I think he will. So you'll be able to review the slides as well. Ron has a hugely informationally packed presentation. I hope you guys will enjoy it. I know I certainly will. Before we jump in, I just want to tell you a little bit about who's going to be speaking tonight. As I mentioned, Ron Moritz, who's an advisor, a consultant, and an OurCrowd mentor. I'll let him talk about to introduce himself. I'm not going to do him justice, but he was a C-level employee, particularly in the security field, both for Symantec and Computer Associates. He's very involved in doing work in OurCrowd, but he is probably what I believe to be one of the foremost experts in the cybersecurity field in the world. There's little old me on the right-hand side of that slide that you see. I'm the head of an investor community here at OurCrowd. I've written a book on the investment case using social media, using some of the new tools that we have, of which crowdfunding is one. That's what OurCrowd does. We look at we have deal flow here in Israel and around the world. We look at what we believe to be some of the best investment opportunities. We approach it as a venture capitalist will with a due diligence team. We run it through the ringer here. Of the 150 deals that we see every month, we probably do 2 or 3 of those. Those appear on our website. And angel investors from around the world. We have active investors from over 30 countries right now who have invested in almost 40 deals in some of the best technology companies in the world, some of which are in the cybersecurity field, and some of which actually Ron Moritz is an advisor and a board member too. So just a little bit, and Ron can talk about this more. We have 3 companies in our cybersecurity portfolio here. NativeFlow, which basically is focused on the bring your own device market, selling to large corporations. Fireblade, which is a company that focuses on basically scrapers and preventing hackers from the outside to websites. BioCatcher is one of our newest companies, does actually ongoing behavioral profiling, not just at the time somebody logs into their account, but continuously monitors to see if the person is who they say they are by looking at the actual behavior, the actual typing behavior of a user if they're logging into a bank site. That's just a snippet of what we do. Ron's obviously going to put that in a much broader perspective in terms of talking about some of the trends, and I think that's what you'll take away, and that's what got me excited about this webinar. Ron's going to really approach this for somebody who knows a lot about the industry. You'll get a lot out of this, and somebody who's new to the cybersecurity industry. Ron's presentation does a fantastic job of kind of giving you the layout and the playing field, not necessarily from the individual companies in that field, but sort of what are the overriding trends and sort of what's pushing cybersecurity to the forefront of the public's knowledge and to corporations' knowledge. Ron is going to be able to address all that. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ron. I'm going to turn the controls over to Ron. Ron's going to start the presentation. So Ron, maybe you want to start by introducing yourself?
Well, first of all, I've always wanted to say this: good morning, good afternoon, and good night, right? Because we've got people from around the globe, so it's a pleasure to have you join us today. And I really look forward to chatting with you, and we'll have an opportunity to answer questions as they come up. I'm actually sitting at the Fireblade office in Tel Aviv, having spent the afternoon here. So one of the portfolio companies that I'm involved with. But in my background, I grew up on the side of the table that was dealing with the issues from a corporate side. as I like to say, before the field was very fashionable and in vogue as it is today. And we really didn't have a lot of technology we could call upon. So we spent about 50% of our time at that, this was in the 1980s and 1990s, spent about 50% of our time looking for technology that didn't exist, 50% of our time begging for a few dollars from the CIO to pay for the products that we found. And it was only in the third 50% of the time that we actually got to have fun and stalk the wily hacker. Today the industry is obviously much transformed. We'll talk a little bit about why that happened. I jumped from the customer side, as it were, or the practitioner side, to the vendor side in the mid-90s, having helped create a company out of Israel called Finjan Software to deal with some of the early problems of malicious code that were traveling on the internet at the time. We will actually talk about some of the later generations technologies today that they call APT, or Advanced Persistent Threats, a little bit later on. From there I ended up at Symantec, where I was global CTO, helped create the technology vision that company executed against throughout most of the last decade. Went and spent some time with the investor community out in California, working with both American and Israeli VCs around cybersecurity investment thesis, and then got pulled into Long Island to work with Computer Associates and build their cybersecurity business in the mid part of last decade, before getting pulled into Israel, or back to Israel I should say, with Microsoft, and took a general manager role with Microsoft, working on their security business out of Israel. I have been involved with the OurCrowd team for a couple of years actually, even though I think officially we say the firm is only about 16 or 18 months old. It seems like much longer, and that's because John Medved and I have a long shared history in the Israeli high-tech community. But today we're going to talk about cybersecurity and what it means, and I think the first place to start might be with the definition. Cybersecurity, it's a name that is currently in fashion. It evolved from the 1960s when we were calling it electronic data processing controls. It morphed into a world called IT audit and eventually IT security, where IT, obviously information technology. At some point it became computer security and then network security. Today there's an interest or a focus area around operational technology security in the power plants and manufacturing facilities, which have been ignored typically because that's not where the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, typically operated. But all in all, cybersecurity seems to cover quite a bit of ground today. But if we actually step back, there is a concept that carries over across anything that we do having to do with security, be it physical security or virtual security. And that's the concept of
Ron,
confidentiality.
I'm sorry to cut you off. This is Zach. I don't think you've started sharing your screen. Do you mind just clicking the green button?
I thought I did. Okay, hang on one second.
Start sharing. There's start sharing.
Did
okay.
you see it?
I don't see it. Are people in the audience see it? You can let me know in the chat. Do you see Ron's slides?
Because it says here on my end that it's sharing.
Okay. People are saying they do not see your slides.
They do not see my slides. All right.
Do you want to go back to me moving through the presentation?
Yeah, I guess we're going to have to do that. All right.
Okay, sorry about that.
Pause sharing, and I'll go back to my slides. All right, so we are on, Zach, we're on slide 2. What is cybersecurity? And the first bullet, cybersecurity, the evolution of a name.
Okay, and please talk up a little bit louder. I think there were some people having trouble hearing you.
Okay, I've got the handset here, so hopefully it'll be clear. The concept of cybersecurity, again, as I said, applies to also any type of security, physical and virtual, is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And typically we would apply those concepts around information. I think today we can apply the same three ideas when we look at both systems and network communications as well as operations. So really anything lives in the world of CIA. That's a fairly good definition. I think the big change today that we see, and we're going to move to the next bullet, is that cybersecurity today also encompasses a concept called offensive capabilities. In other words, I kind of put in a little bit of an analogy. If I'm going to take a can of Raid and try to get rid of some ants that I see in my kitchen, that's one way of dealing with the problem immediately. But if I want to actually deal with the problem long term, I'm going to have to actually put something that the ants are going to carry back into the hive or into the colony, into their nest, and destroy everybody. And I think that's the concept of what I happen to use occasionally in my house, which is called ant honey. And that's what we're going toward in cybersecurity today. Not only the defensive capabilities and the protection and the gates and the guns and the guards, but actually the concept that we need to be able to deal with the problems in a more permanent way. This has typically been the domain of the government, but we are seeing that shift happening slowly. If we go to the next bullet, sometimes the concept of security has been referred to as an insurance policy, but I think that the change again that we're seeing in cybersecurity from a definitional point of view is that it is in fact similar to why you would put a high-performance braking system in a high-performance car. And some people have used that concept in the past to talk about the value of security. Rather than looking at it as a guard dog that may never actually bark, it's about actually enabling the business to continue. So those are some basic definitions around cybersecurity to keep in mind as we go through the session. If we move to the next slide, we'll talk about some of these concepts of cycles, and there's this kind of a historical perspective. I think there's a point in time, we'll call it the before the web days. This is the first bullet, Zach, that we talk about the early virus days, typically small local area networks in departments, not big corporate networks, not broadly distributed networks. Typically, things moved from floppy disk to floppy disk. And this limited access meant that, and the fact that networks were isolated meant that there was very slow propagation of threats. So the concept of cybersecurity was not necessarily something you had to respond to in immediate time. There wasn't a sense of urgency. I think once, if we go to the next bullet, once we started to see the emergence of infrastructure, and Mosaic being the first web browser and the introduction of the World Wide Web, and we saw in the mid-90s the rise of the commercial internet, we started to see first generation of code traveling on the internet. We started to see the emergence of security solutions like the checkpoint firewall and other firewalls that emerged, more advanced antivirus solutions like those that emerged from companies like Symantec and McAfee, because there was a sense or a feeling that bad things would happen once we would be interconnected. And we saw a concept that I think has haunted the security industry for years that is called FUD, or fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or as I would say, death. And that was kind of the first introduction of, why do you need security? Because bad things will happen. Now, if we moved forward into the early 2000s, we saw and this is, sorry, bullet 3, Zach, the burst of the dot-com bubble. When that happened, the double-digit spend shifted from various enabling technologies or applications around the IT organization that allowed the IT to get onto the internet toward security. Security became the on-ramp or a necessity for corporations. And so as a percentage of the IT budget, we saw unprecedented spend. And we'll get back to that spend because we haven't seen that level of spend until now. There's been a gap, and as we go through the history and we go to the next bullet and look at 2002, another inflection point, again, the money that was spent by IT departments on security, partially because of catch-up, partially because it was a necessity to enable the companies to get onto the internet, was unprecedented in the early 2000s. That led, in fact, to a tremendous amount of investment in security technology companies. and we'll get back to that as well. But 2002 was a shift. We saw an inflection point because global technology companies that did not have, prior to that, a true focus or agenda around security stepped forward and said security becomes mission critical. And that included Microsoft with Bill Gates talking about a concept called trustworthy computing. It was Cisco with John Chambers talking about security being the next billion-dollar business for Cisco. And he, of course, accomplished that goal. And it was companies like CA as well, Computer Associates, where I ended up in 2002 because security became exceptionally relevant to them as an enterprise infrastructure solution provider. So that created an inflection point and probably a next generation of concerns that were raised now by global companies and not individual companies focused just on the security industry. The next inflection point, bullet number 5, came in 2005, and it is what I call a distraction. It was the rise of the consumer internet. It was Web 2.0, it was social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, some of the other names that you've heard about and know about. This concept caused a change in investment philosophy. Suddenly, it was relatively easy to launch a company for about $50,000. And $50,000 became the new benchmark for what investors would have to put in to create one of these consumer internet companies, which would create a simple application and get a lot of people to sign up for that and call themselves successful. This distraction, if we keep moving on, actually flowed into the global economic crash. And the result of that was obviously downward pressure on budgets across the enterprise community as a whole on a global basis, and obviously IT budget squeezes that affected security spend as well. This entire period from about the mid-2000s through what I would call the end of the 2000s, because of the economic crash, did not lend itself well to the creation of a lot of innovation in security. There was simply no money available to invest in that. Now, what happened as we move on to the next bullet in 2011, there was a shift in the attention around security. One of the reasons that shift happened was because of the emergence of these mobile platforms, the smartphones, the tablets, and so forth. And all things media caused kind of a redirection. And we started to see discussion about security concerns, privacy concerns at the national level, meaning in the newspapers like USA Today and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and LA Times and so forth. The discussion was no longer technical and limited to the industry or to enterprise IT security people. It was a broader discussion. But investment even then was still somewhat restrained until we saw a shift that really solidified where we were in 2013. And that was as a result of really sensational activities, Snowden, and the theft of confidential information and the distribution of that confidential information. We suddenly saw what was going to happen in science fiction, say from the NSA snooping and the disclosures around NSA snooping, that we said it's no longer just a concern of those who are in the industry. It is actually personal. People understood what it meant to them. And of course, we started to see major breaches of corporate security infrastructure with impact on executive officers. So we got to the point where we, I think, took a shift in 2013 from the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, that was part of the marketing propaganda of the security industry through its first, let's call it 15 or 20 years, to where we are today, which is an understanding that security problems are legitimate and they're not going away. If we move on to the next page, we can then start to look at the what I think are the two key cybersecurity drivers that are propelling this industry. One is that governments and corporations are under attack. The attack is real. It's not simply a nuisance anymore where somebody disabled a website, or the Syrian army, hacker army, put a little distraction out on the website and compromised access to a website for a temporary period of time. We're seeing real litigation, real criminal complaints that are being filed against organizations who have not done sufficient work, who have not taken diligence around their systems of control, who have had a lack of responsibility around cybersecurity. I think, as we said, Snowden was a sensational thing, but the NSA problem, the NSA snooping, was very personal. And it validated, not only for cybersecurity professionals and academicians what was possible, but it actually confirmed that they've gone beyond what we even imagined was possible, that the capability was beyond real. And of course, even this month, and last week I believe it was, that the Department of Justice in the United States talked publicly about a fairly significant breach and what we would call industrial espionage against U.S. corporations and that type of eavesdropping. The second driver, I think, is that we are finally seeing what security people like me, who have been in this industry for 20 or more years, have been proclaiming. And unfortunately, many of our complaints have fallen on deaf ears over the years. But trying to convince an executive officer that they should focus on cybersecurity or information security or an information strategy, a security strategy, has been very challenging. It's much easier to focus on other things that are much more exciting in terms of corporate growth. But when we start to see executives at companies like Target terminated for their responsibility in a major breach, that does have an impact across the board and in boardrooms themselves. So we are starting to see, again, we talked about the unprecedented release of funds in the early 2000s as corporations were catching up in their security investments to be able to get onto the internet. And we're seeing a very similar trend today, where typically as a percentage of the IT budget, security might be 5%, industry average, higher in some industries that are more sensitive, perhaps finance and healthcare and things of that nature, but generally 5%. Today we are seeing double-digit spend on security technologies in the enterprise. So these budgets are a reflection of the concern that executive officers have over their own liability and concerns over their responsibility for the enterprise. So if we go to the next slide, we are talking about businesses today being under fire, organizations that have exposures, new attacks that are very much targeted and purposeful. There's a reason behind these attacks. The variety and the styles of the attacks, the complexity of the attacks are increasing as well. If we go to the next bullet, the hackers themselves are, in the words of General Keith Alexander, who I'm in Israel, so I don't follow this as perhaps well as I should. When I prepared these slides last fall, he was still the NSA director. There may have been a change there, but I don't know. But when he was the NSA director, he said that these attacks are the greatest wealth transfer in history. And when you think of what that means, it exactly reflects what we saw last week in the announcement by the DOJ, with organizations sponsored by states, nation states, that are out there looking for intellectual property, business plans, strategy documents, engineering documents, and whatever they may need or feel to make their industry competitive. Typically, if I wanted that IP in a normal structure and friendly business environment, I would go and acquire that company. But why do I need to acquire the company if I can simply steal everything that they have and create something else, a competitor, with the exact same capability? So this is valued by the NSA to be about $250 billion a year in IP that's lost as a result of cybersecurity problems. If we move to the third bullet, there's a significant year-over-year increase in the number of attacks themselves. So So we see a 68% increase at the federal level as reported by the Department of Homeland Security, and certainly the number of attacks on corporations are up significantly as well. And the last bullet, that the U.S. government itself is increasing spend on cybersecurity, even though that they're cutting in other areas. If we go to the next page, page 6, the macro cybersecurity topics that we want to perhaps think about as we consider what cybersecurity means. One is cloud computing, and I think we've read about that quite a bit in any newspaper you pick up. It's a redefinition of what the data center is. It's no longer something that the enterprise owns. It's something that's just simply out there and somebody else takes care of it. And if somebody else is taking care of it and you're putting your sensitive corporate data out there, what are the risks of doing that? Yet that train definitely has left the station. The value proposition of cloud computing drives this redefinition. The second bullet, advanced persistent threats, this is the ongoing cat and mouse game between the hackers, who constantly look for opportunities to get into networks and get access to information and create ever more sophisticated attacks, and of course the technology that we want to use or that we need to introduce to prevent those attacks. So that's a business that's not going to go away. We're in either the 4th or 5th generation of technology companies that are trying to solve that problem. The name has changed from simply malware to today we call it advanced persistent threats, but that's another touch point for cybersecurity. The third is mobility and device security, dealing with the problem of BYOD, bring your own device, where employees are bringing in very capable technology that they've bought themselves. It's a consumer product for use with the enterprise, be it in some cases a traditional laptop, but in most cases tablets and smartphones. The fourth bullet is risk management, issues of regulatory integrity, compliance, business continuity, and in fact this new concept of social media and how social media becomes a threat or a risk to the business. And identity and access management, the fifth bullet, that's something that likely will never be disconnected from security. It's the whole process of authenticating people into systems, giving them the right authorization, the right access. And that is not as, I guess, in some sense, revolutionary, but remains a macro topic in cybersecurity. I think the last bullet, which I called verticalization, is in fact something that's relatively new. We've always looked at security as a horizontal, as a one-size-fits-all. What I do for one industry sector should be sufficient in another industry sector. A firewall is a firewall is a firewall. An antivirus solution is an antivirus solution is an antivirus solution. No matter what industry sector you're part of, you need it. What's happening today is that individual sectors, individual industry groups are in fact demanding unique and different security solutions than other groups. The needs of financial services, for example, differ than the needs of energy, oil and gas, and others. And so even though financial services may have a central bank and branches, which is a similar concept to, say, energy companies, which may have a central headquarters and a lot of manufacturing facilities distributed in a broad area, the type of operations they have create different types of challenges. And so we are seeing verticalization of security. If we move to the next slide, and I'll go through this one very quickly because it's a concept that Gartner, one of the big analyst firms, created a year ago to talk about not just security, but what they call the nexus of forces that are truly changing the way IT or the corporate CIO has to approach the world of technology and the services he delivers inside the enterprise. And these are the concepts of all-the-time access, driven by mobility and mobile computing. It is the concept of global delivery, meaning I'm going to have to provide my data everywhere and anywhere at the same level of performance and with the same level of controls. And in some cases, I'm going to have to comply with unique regulations that are specific to countries. and in terms of how that data gets distributed and used. There's a concept called big data or big context, information that is coming from so many different sources that it can only provide value if it's analyzed in a more complete way than it has been to date. This concept of understanding the context of data in order to be able to actually deliver true information, actionable information. And then extreme behavior, the introduction of concepts of social media into the enterprise and how enterprise has to deal with that. And this is what David Cowan, a VC from Bessemer, who's been involved in the security business for many, many years, called a tsunami of change rocking the IT world. So many different ways that these technology pressures are forcing enterprises to change. So this leads us to a few slides on what I would call security trends, and just in the interest of time and making sure we have time for questions, I'm going to run through these very quickly, but as Zack said, I'll make this slide deck available through OurCrowd. The first trend that I think is important to consider, and it's valuable when we look at these trends, all of the trends on the next 3 pages that will be introduced, it's important to understand these trends in the context of opportunities for investment, opportunities for startups themselves. One is this enhanced use of encryption. Encryption is a very old concept. It's you can go historically and track back the need to secure messages throughout history. But in the context of technology, it's always been considered a very difficult proposition. Companies like RSA, a division of EMC, has built its business on the basis of encryption. But if we really look at some of the challenges we have today, we are being forced to do more with encryption than we've ever done before. If we go to the next bullet, there's a concept of looking at the data that we have and creating a different type of analysis than we've had to be able to create what's called, and this is a military term, situational awareness. Really being able to analyze and interpret suspicious behavior that typically is now associated with the theft or a typical type of attack that's meant not just to be a nuisance, but actually to be disruptive. So we're going to see this concept of data analysis emerge as a trend in security. There is a resistance, if we go last bullet on this page, resistance to cloud technology. What I mean is that, as we said, when we move the data outside of the control of the data center, the traditional physical boundary of the corporation where corporate employees were responsible for it, and we're now putting it in the hands of external platforms and infrastructures, either those owned by Amazon Web Services or IBM or Google or whoever it might be, there is concern, and rightfully so. There's huge rewards. The efficiency and the access to the data and the applications that we could put out there are fantastic. But these efficiencies are currently offset by the concerns and the liabilities that would exist if we simply pushed everything out there willy-nilly. So in this case, cybersecurity is really, again, the equivalent of the car brakes. It's not something that slows it down. It's something that enables this to actually happen. Just like the car brakes enable you to go fast because you know you have a good braking system. Go to the next slide on trends, risk assessment, software analysis. This is a concept that we're going to actually do a better job not only writing strong software that's less vulnerable to compromise, something that the industry is aware that it has to do. It's a responsibility of any software development. But we're going to create technology to help us do a better job screening the software that we use, validating that it's legitimate, making sure that if it has to be fixed, it'll be fixed in a very quick and effective way. So that's the concept of risk assessment software analysis. We are, as another trend, seeing many more destructive attacks. We're seeing real damage to industry, to systems that they use. Compromise of systems is one thing where data may leak out. The destruction of systems so they're no longer available is a different concept altogether, and we are seeing very much politically and politically motivated attacks designed for harm. The third bullet on this page, we talked a little bit already about this concept of smartphone being a key technology platform, and malware that in fact that is a concern to that platform that will continue to be a concern for the industry. And finally, phishing and hacking of individual users. If the controls in the enterprise strengthen, then it's natural that we would see that the attack vector or the opportunity will move to the weakest link. And the weakest link in this point is going to be the individual. And we're seeing ongoing attempts to compromise individuals in the process of trying to gain access to the enterprise. So we'll see that as well as an ongoing trend. Go to the third slide. We are seeing, and I mentioned this before, more sophisticated malware. Some of us tuned into an announcement from one of the Symantec executives talking about antivirus is dead, and that made some headlines a few weeks ago. It's not dead, but its efficiency is certainly diminished, and its effectiveness is questionable. So we are seeing more interesting technologies emerge as the viruses, as the malware becomes more intense and sophisticated. The second bullet on active defense is a concept that's also been actually a relatively old concept, but is actually getting some traction today, which is the idea that we're going to direct the bad guys to an area that is something that we're monitoring. They think it's the real place that they want to attack, and it's really just a trap. And that kind of concept allows us to actually take retaliatory action, which is some of the offensive ideas in cybersecurity today. The other area, the third bullet, talks about this concept of following up to the threats. The performance, our response, has to be faster than ever before. And one of the ways that I think we'll see emerge as an opportunity to deal with this rapid response is to use an Associated Press kind of model, where you have a lot of, the Associated Press has a lot of people in the field, and they become a primary source of information to a lot of other organizations that want to report on the news, but certainly can't put people on the ground everywhere. And so this concept of an MSSP, Managed Security Service Provider, has been tried and tried again for the last 15, 20 years. I think we're getting closer. The idea of aggregating experts and having corporations rely on these experts that are residing in certain for-profit corporations that provide those services will continue to be a focus area. And finally, this concept of threat intelligence, which is interesting, and I put a little sidebar bullet there at the bottom. Security and threat intelligence is a concept that we've heard a lot about in the last year or so. Everybody talks about security and threat intelligence technology and solutions. But one blogger recently wrote something that I thought was very accurate, that it's somewhat like teenage sex. Everybody talks about it, but not many people are doing anything about it. Not many people are actually doing it. And in fact, those that are in fact trying to do it, they're not necessarily doing it well. So I thought that kind of works. We are seeing a lot of fraud tools and technologies emerging from the startups. In this category, by the way, FireEye, which is a relatively significant company, certainly with a $5 billion market cap, you can't dismiss it. This is their space as well. But this idea of taking information and making it, or data, and making it actionable, telling what the IT staff what to do, we're still a little bit far away. So we'll continue to see opportunities there. Now, I want to slide into concepts of more on the investment side, and the next slide talks about one of several that talks about money that follows problems. And in this case, I think we've laid out a number of problems, but some of these things are worth understanding a little bit further. One is the new threat vectors that we've talked about is limiting our ability to leverage the internet. We've talked about this in the concept of mobile platforms and cloud platforms. So we're seeing cash invested in companies that are providing those types of security services, and Native Flow, of course, is one of those companies. Security is moving to the board level as a discussion. When I wrote this up last year before the Target breach and the Neiman Marcus breach, the general concept was 80% of Global 2000 boards are talking about cybersecurity. But I would say that at this point, I'm guessing 100% are there. The next bullet, Gartner estimates that 39% is the increase in security spend. If we look at this $67 billion in 2013, this is a number that's associated not only with security products but also services. That jumps up to $93 billion. When you see that kind of growth, investors tune into that number and say, this could be a good place to be. The fourth bullet here, cybersecurity itself is ripe for the harvest, right? So we're seeing an annual growth rate that's a compelling metric. And finally, the last bullet, the news is just too much to ignore. VCs are, many are very bright, but they like trends. And when there's headlines, they'll run after those trends. And I think that investors typically do the same thing. When we read about these problems, we say we want a piece of that. We want to help solve that problem. So as long as cyber attacks remain in the headline, we'll see investment follow. The next slide talks about this boom. And I think, again, some numbers that are relevant. If we look at the global investment in 2011, it was up 94% over 2010. In 2012, that number reached $1 billion. And we're talking about investment in private startup companies. We're not talking about the exits. We're not talking about the IPOs. We're not talking about the M&A. We're talking about pure investments in startup companies, private companies. In 2013, the estimate was that this was a $1.5 billion global investment and 240 cybersecurity companies that received or were the beneficiaries of that investment dollar. The next bullet talks about no end in sight. When you see the growth in valuation of these companies, and we look in 2013 and we see a 41% increase in valuation on a deal size over 2012, that's a significant number. Not to say that 2011 to 2012 wasn't significant at 26%, but clearly people are putting money behind these companies, and that's causing supply and demand and some kind of growth in the valuation. Now, that brings me to my last bullet on this slide, which is the caveat emptor, which is, are we heading toward a bubble? And I think that those of us in the industry are wondering that. We see the valuations that have more than doubled in the past 2 years. There is a little bit of discomfort, right? But at the same time, I think we can balance that by having exceptional diligence and making sure that we take the long view here. These are companies that are being built out for the long term. These problems that they're solving are not here today, gone tomorrow. So I think that we can, in fact, justify certain valuations as we look in the long term at the possibilities for these companies and where they may go. Now, that kind of brings us to the exit discussion, which is the next slide, number 13, and the concept of M&A. There were 23 M&A deals in 2013 in the space of cybersecurity, and just this year alone, up until, we're really talking about the first 4 months, 5 months, we've seen 17 deals. I've listed some of the numbers there, some of them in red, the two in red, Cisco buying SourceFire and FireEye Mandiant, some crazy numbers, crazy multiples, but that's certainly trickling down to the valuations of the smaller companies. When we look at these cybersecurity enterprise value to revenue multiples of 9.9, that's pretty interesting. Nevertheless, keep in mind that these numbers don't even begin to compare to some of the things that we see in the consumer internet world and social media. And of course, companies like Waze immediately come to mind. If we move to the next bullet, the IPO side of it, again, unprecedented number of IPOs in the security industry. That data point obviously motivates investors to look at cybersecurity as opportunistic. So, in addition to seeing some amazing valuations and market caps, we're seeing some quality companies that are able to begin to consolidate around them. We are also seeing the last bullet, private equity carve-outs and roll-ups, and I mentioned one because it was very interesting. When AirWatch received roughly, depending on where you look, it's either $150 or $200 million from Insight in early 2013, we all assumed that it was going to be to allow them to become an aggregator of smaller technologies. It was a war chest. Was a little bit of a surprise when we saw VMware acquire the same company a year later for $1.5 billion. So, clearly things are happening on the PE side as well that are motivating us. Now, I think it is important to look at the next slide and talk about this concept of a fragmented market, because this is a market that, although we call it relatively mature, it's an industry group, it's a sector, we understand what we need to do, but there is no dominant leader. This is unlike many other sectors. And when you don't have a single leader in a market that has a significant enough market share to be able to influence the direction of the industry, it means there's going to be a lot of fragmentation, a lot of fighting, a lot of different ideas that emerge. Fantastic for startups, but certainly leaves us in a different type of environment where we still have to create a lot of relationships in order to solve problems. I think there is a possibility for a company to emerge with an acquisitive growth strategy that will position it to mimic what Cisco did in the 1990s to become a dominant leader in the network world. But at the moment, we're seeing a lot of fragmentation. The next bullet talks about the different types of threats. I think we've covered that enough. The value point here is that it means that nimble startups are truly in a position to find their place and their path and their purpose. And the big co's who have a tremendous struggle to innovate will have to continue to acquire. And I think that the last bullet that I have here is when we look at a fragmented market and we see a sector that is ripe for investment, then we have to provide a certain path for entrepreneurs that helps them and moves them along, perhaps even at a faster rate than we've seen in the past. And I think some of the triggers here, we see what I think is the first cybersecurity accelerator that was actually introduced in Virginia with the support of the state government called Mach 37. We see a similar strategy in Israel to some degree coming out of the Chief Scientist Office and the commitment from the Prime Minister's office around Beersheba and the JVP National Cybersecurity Incubator. Cisco and Lockheed Martin, of course, made commitments to the Beersheba initiatives as well, where Israel wants to focus its cybersecurity industry. So we are seeing this kind of what I call it a coddling around the initiatives. Moving on to the next slide, cybersecurity M&As, the multiples are at really at a peak and an all-time high, 9.9, 10%. I'm sorry, 10x is trailing 12 months revenue is exceptional. I think we'll continue to see this activity. I think brand names have to energize themselves through innovation, which they don't do. So they have to do it because they don't do it organically. They have to do it through growth. I think that the second bullet, the money is pouring in, but as I said, a VC pullback may be possible. I don't think it's likely in the near term, but I think that eventually we will get to some point of saturation. I think that what the key here is that you might see great A-quality technology. The APT space, Advanced Persistent Threat, is notorious for this. Every company I see has amazing technology, a different approach to solve the same problem. I love them all. But ultimately it comes down to execution. And I think one of the mantras of any good investor is I want to invest in an A team, even if it has a B technology, because that A team is going to execute, it's going to perform. And oftentimes we just don't have the talent, and that's I think part of the saturation problem. We don't always have the talent to take great technology all the way. Now, ultimately, I think that there is an IPO option, but consolidation will continue, and it has to, because, again, the brand names want to have cachet, and they can't get there, and they can't solve all the problems themselves. The innovation happening from the bad guy side outpaces the ability of the big companies or the brand names to deliver solutions. So this again gives us opportunities on the early stage company side. A number of M&A drivers at the bottom that I think are worth considering. The integrated suite leaders always need innovation. There are platforms that are evolving. One that we talk about is a software-defined data center, an external data center, almost a virtual data center. Those platforms need security solutions. The cloud needs security solutions. Of course, I think one of the big things that's going to drive this industry in the M&A side is the non-traditional acquirers. What we talk about as system integrators, traditional defense contractors, the Lockheed Martins, the even big conglomerates like General Electric, the companies that haven't traditionally looked at cybersecurity technology as a necessity or as an opportunity, and today are absolutely looking at that, and that's going to drive some of the M&A. So I think one of the things I wanted to talk about very quickly is how you pick the winners then. You know, how do you succeed in on the investor side? And one is that you look for groups, this is slide 16, Zach, look for groups with domain expertise. And that's, you know, simple concepts. Does the team have a background in this sector, or are they just jumping into it because it's hot? You know, do they understand what the customers need? Do they know how to sell to these customers? Do they know what the buying cycle is for the customers that they're selling to? Do they understand the channels that they're dealing with and the ecosystem in which they play? And do they even know how to prioritize the customer needs and figure out what features actually will work? When I find companies that can't answer these basic questions, they may have great technology that they absolutely believe in because they're all great entrepreneurs, but they don't know how to do anything with that technology in terms of selling it. I've got to pass. That's not the team I'm going to be confident in. They're not the team that's going to be able to bring that product to market. And then that's related to the second bullet, which is, you know, does this team actually know the vertical market in which it plays? Do they understand if they're looking to solve a problem in healthcare, and the move of healthcare organizations to cloud technologies, and that's what they're focusing on. Do they know that? Do they really know how to roll systems that they're building into those markets and into those platforms? Do they understand how they fit into a broader ecosystem there? Do they understand how the buyers of those solutions actually work? And ultimately, the question that nearly every entrepreneur fails on, at least the first time I ask it, you know, what is their breakout plan? How do they differentiate themselves in a market that's crowded with a lot of different people offering all interesting solutions, but in different ways? You know, how do they get the attention of the buyer? How do they really legitimize themselves and create a breakout? And so that leads me to a couple questions on the next slide, 17, that were submitted up front, which is, you know, the first one was, what was the process that we look at in terms of funding? You know, what's the traction around the idea and the product? And I'm going to talk about it from a security point of view, but, you know, the first thing that I look at is absolutely the commitment of the team, their engagement. You know, is this the A team? Do I see an entrepreneur that has left everything else on the side and is fully committed? Oftentimes I'll see entrepreneurs that are just testing the water. They're involved in a lot of different projects. This is one of them. That's not for me. I look at their pitch, I look at their what I call a new venture business plan outline, and I try to understand if it's truly an A opportunity. There's a number of face-to-face meetings that we do. After phone meetings, we do a fairly extensive job vetting the team and trying to assess whether they have what it takes to execute. The term sheet negotiation, followed by a very technical due diligence process to validate the technology itself and to make sure that the solution is real, including the engagements with the prospective market, customers who may be using it already in some form, and others who may be able to provide us with a kind of an independent validation to assess whether or not the opportunity is real and whether we can actually sell into this market. And finally, I think it's very important to be able to explain what it is that you're doing in very clear and very simple terminology, not in geek talk. People have to understand what you're doing. I think that one other question that came up was, how are the first customers captured? And at least, in the best of teams, it's what I call a street fighter mentality. The entrepreneurs who leverage their personal networks, who are really out there finding a champion who's going to be their number one spokesman, who's basically not on their payroll but just loves what they're doing. And the good entrepreneurs know how to find those guys. And finally, last question here was, what level of funding are they raising? What are they using the funds for? And I think that the only way I really could figure it out how to answer this was that typically an Israeli company that wants to go to the United States, or a European company that wants to go to the United States, or an Australian company that wants to go to the United States, going to the United States, that is the market. If you prove yourself in the United States, the rest of the world opens up. So the U.S. first strategy is critical, and typically today we look at about a $3 million cost to set up operations in the U.S. That's the minimum gunpowder that I would look at for their business plan. Now, if they haven't yet validated and they're earlier, then typically we're looking at about a $200,000 to $500,000 kind of a launch cost to build some early prototypes and validate. So those are some questions that came up. Just quickly, some things that I think are worth mentioning on the next slide, some of the things that are on my radar. I mentioned encryption before. Just last week there was an announcement that Silent Circle, which is an encryption communication platform, raised $30 million to create a black phone, meaning a proprietary phone that's what they believe is completely locked down. I mentioned another company that I learned about shortly after the WhatsApp acquisition, which was called Threema, some guys in Switzerland who created a encryption equivalent to WhatsApp, which could be interesting to some people. I think protecting data in the cloud is part of the encryption story, and I mentioned a few companies that might be relevant out of Israel that are part of that story. The next bullet talks about cloud-based security services. Certainly Fireblade in website security and acceleration is one of those companies, but there are a lot of places where we look at the cloud and security is an enabling technology there to get rid of the objections of the enterprise. The third bullet, threat intelligence. We talked about finding the needle in the haystack. A couple of companies there, Secular, an Israeli company that's one of the leaders in this space. And the last bullet talks about fraud prevention. This is an interesting space because fraud is one of these things that everybody kind of dismisses, and maybe it's the cost of doing business. But these days we are seeing more creative solutions, some that actually look at the geography and location-based information when they look at who you are and where you're connecting from, and adding that to the context, in sense of context-aware security. And BioCatch, which is one of my new favorite companies, where we're looking at authentication that's continuous, not at the point of entry, not at the gate, but actually throughout the time that you're engaged in that transaction system. So those are some trends, and I think in the interest of time, I see that we're probably at time. I'm not going to really cover the big data concepts here, but there is a big data revolution that's occurring, and I think the impact on security and the security industry is not even understood yet. Two concepts that I think are relevant in this discussion. One is that we're starting to see science that imitates art, and those who've seen the Steven Spielberg Minority Report movie may recognize the term precognition, the ability to anticipate, to use a tremendous amount of data to anticipate and predict things that are going to happen, and I think that's going to be an evolutionary change in security. And of course, the last highlighted red concept at the bottom here, that we're going to see industry fragmentation and no dominant market share leader for quite a bit longer. Last concepts, character is much easier kept than recovered. And I think this is a very old idea for those who are not Americans on the call. Thomas Paine was a very well-known figure in the United States in the early days of the United States. And I think that some of the things that he talked about are relevant to security. in terms of your character. Security is still a knee-jerk reaction, typically a response to an attack. As we've seen in the case of Target, the response is too little, too late. Infrastructure, IT security infrastructure is still being considered on an ad hoc basis. It's not necessarily inherent yet into operations across the board. The third bullet, security, is a broad set of technologies. As we said, we don't have a single dominant leader. You can't go to one source to buy everything you need. So there's no concept of proactive security. I'm going to buy it and it's going to be there and I'm done. And finally, the concept that, again, I attribute to a quote from David Cowan, security never gets solved. And that's great for those of us who love this space and who want to invest in here, because there's always going to be new ideas and new problems and new opportunities to solve those problems. So with that, I'll open it up to questions and try to answer them as they come, and for those who want to stick around.
Hey, Ron. First of all, let me thank you for a great presentation. I learned a lot. That was like a cybersecurity 101 course, so thank you. I'll let you catch your breath. There were a couple questions that came through, primarily on the valuation topic that you brought up before. Sort of that you've seen valuations, up significantly over the past couple of years. One investor asks, is that a sign of a frothy market, or is it that the companies that are getting funding at this point are a little bit more mature, a little bit further along the maturity curve?
It's the former, not the latter. I think we are seeing. So the concept would be as follows: if I took a company, let's call it Company X with technology Y, and I looked at what they were, at least initially asking vis-a-vis their pre-investment valuation, that company 2 or 3 years ago would have never dared to come to the table with that type of pre-money valuation based on where they are. So what I'm talking about is a company with no sales traction yet, no revenue, zero revenue company. The idea is, validated to some degree. There may be some beta testers. There may be some early deployments, but no real deals that have been done, no revenue. They come to me and they say, my valuation today pre-money, $10 million, $15 million, $20 million, in some cases $30 million and beyond. These concepts don't necessarily always make sense. I'll get back to the reason why in a moment, but if I went back in time 2-3 years ago, same company, same state of where their development is, they could not have even dared to have that discussion. Now, I'll give you a great example. There's a wonderful accelerator out of California, Northern California, called UpWest. And UpWest brings Israeli entrepreneurs out to California for a 4-month boot camp, typical accelerator model. There was a company that came out of UpWest that I was asked to look at a year ago in April of 2013. So they were 2 or 3 months into their accelerator process. They were in the cybersecurity world, and I spent time with the entrepreneurs. Again, great technology, great idea, great approach to solving the problem. So how are you going to differentiate yourself? How are you going to go to market? How are you going to get the attention of the CSO, the buyer, the chief security officer in the enterprise, given the fact that there's 30 or 40 or 50 APT companies and seemingly a new one emerging every week? And they couldn't answer that. And I said, this is a real problem from an investment thesis point of view. Well, lo and behold, they finished their acceleration program. July came along and they managed to raise some seed money, about $1.5 million. No idea what the valuation for that $1.5 million was. But the surprise came this past winter, February or so, when it was announced that this company had raised $12 million. Right? So this is a company that a year ago was just starting their path in an accelerator. It's a company that there's no way that the product is even finished, right? And yet, here we are in early 2014, they get $12 million, so now a total of $13.5 million into the company. Now you look at that and you say, that valuation, and it was a tier 1 VC, it's not a secondary, confused VC, it's a reputable and trustworthy VC. that company has to have a valuation, finger in the wind, I don't know what it is, but 20 to 30 and maybe even beyond that. The problem with those kind of valuations is what happens in 18 months when they've burned through that money and they need to come back to the marketplace for additional investment. That's the point where you say, is their pre-money valuation now really $40 million? They still don't have a lot of traction. And so I think there is a potential problem in the marketplace that we are starting to wonder whether or not we're approaching a bit of a bubble here. We don't know, but in the meantime, there is certainly dollars and interested investors, and I don't think they're all throwing their money away. I think they're just simply paying premiums.
Thanks, Ron. We have one more question. I know we ran late. We try to be very sensitive about the hour. It was a very all-inclusive webinar. We have an investor who asks, what are A, average pre-money for seed stage startups in Israel, and B, average all-in capital amounts consumed by security startups and median exit amounts? It's a big question.
Wow. That is a big question.
You want to chop it up?
Yeah.
So average pre-money for seed startups.
Yeah, on the pre-money side, it really varies. I've seen companies coming and asking for as little as a few $100,000 to get them enough runway to validate their assumptions in the marketplace. In other words, developing the technology is the easy part for many of these guys. They write it. They develop it. Working with a development partner, an enterprise of some sort, that helps them validate and tune their solution to be able to come back and say, yes, there is a market for this, and this is what that market looks like, and this is the additional engineering we need to do, and this is the additional go-to-market work that we need to do, to be able to then come back and have a more substantial discussion about their future and their use of capital and their need for capital. That could be as little as $200,000 to $300,000 to $400,000. But to be able to actually have a more serious discussion about kind of first sales, getting the product past prototype into its first generation, its first production version, it's typically going to look like $1 million to $2 million. And oftentimes we're even seeing entrepreneurs saying, you know what, the fundraising, I'm sorry, that's $1 to $2 million, not on the valuation, that's $1 to $2 million on the raise. That's what they're looking to raise. And they're raising that much this early, and then typically if you would take a finger in the wind, they're willing to give up 20%, 25% of their company. So that, they take $1 million and, the post money is going to be $4 million. These kind of companies are looking and saying, why should I, limit myself to $1 million? If the market will allow, I'll take $2 million. And so I'm going to give away 25% of my company for $2 million, but it means I boost my post-money valuation to $8 million, and the marketplace is tolerant. So I think it's a matter of interest in the security, just like any other real estate concept. The supply and demand. The entrepreneurs themselves are becoming more aggressive. If the money is available today, I'm going to go get it. And if the valuation is high, so be it. And many of them, the less mature ones, don't understand the long-term consequences of overvaluing today. It looks great when I talk to grandma, not so great when I need to go back out to the market in a year. Zach, what was the second part of the question?
So what about the other side of that equation? So you talked about sort of pre-money and how much companies need to raise to get off the ground. The second part of that question was how much all-in will a company need to get to that exit level? The exit level. What are a couple examples in the marketplace of companies that have successfully exited? You mentioned a few of those. How much money have they raised in total?
Right. So that is not it's not a clear metric there because it really depends on the sector and the problem that you're solving in this very broad domain of security. Security has a lot of components to it. I tried to mention some of them. Some are easier to solve and easier to sell into. Some of them are more complicated, and the sales cycle itself is longer. But typically, if you look at a enterprise, we're not talking about consumer products here. We're talking about enterprise products, typically sold to the largest of corporations that have the ability to evaluate and deploy these technologies and have the need. But there's a second grouping as well. Mid-sized corporations need this as well. So if you look at the process of selling into an enterprise, and I'm looking at the American model, not the European one, it's not uncommon to see a 12 to 18 month sales cycle just to sell into a single enterprise, the first deployment. That's not necessarily the long-term life opportunity of that customer, but the first deployment. That means that from the first conversation I have, let's say I have a conversation with a bank today. I managed to reach the right guy at the bank, and I'm having that conversation. I convinced him that my product is fantastic and absolutely solves the need he has. And oh, by the way, that need is in the top priority list that he has for the current year. It's likely that I'm going to have to wait as much as 6 months, even though he's super excited, just to get into the queue of what they call the environmental testing. They have to put it into a platform that is a duplication or a mimic of the production environment, of the actual environment that the real software runs on. And there's so many products that need to be tested that you have to actually find a slot. You have to schedule in a slot. It's worse than trying to get an appointment with a doctor in Israel's socialized medicine system. So you have to wait 6 months before you get in there. Now, once you're in there, maybe the technical evaluation is relatively quick. Maybe it only takes a month. Maybe it takes 6 weeks. But then you have to go through the process of purchasing office review. Everybody has to sign off, and sometimes it's a challenge because you're a small company. So it's very easy to see some of these sales cycles stretch out, and oftentimes these companies don't understand that when they actually look at trying to figure out when they're going to start to see revenue coming in to offset the cost of startup. So it's not unlikely that a company that raises, let's say, $5 to $7 million today that enables them to go out to the United States, we talked about a $3 million minimum burn to launch operations in the United States to give you the runway, and oftentimes we'll even see a higher number. So you take that $5 or $7 million you just raised, you begin your operations in the United States. 18 months later, you're just starting to see that traction. And then you're going out back to the market saying, look, I've burned through the money that I took. I need another $10 or $15 million. But the market looks at you, or the investors look at you and they say, yeah, well, you're actually doing what you said. Your pipeline looks fantastic. You're making traction. You're actually executing as we expected. So here's your $10 or $15 million, and you continue to develop your market. You eventually go to other markets. You develop various channels, all of which cost you money. You're enhancing your technology all the way, so you're adding to your engineering staff. It's not uncommon to see an enterprise security company that eventually gets to say, revenue positive situation. They're now generating 10, 15, $20 million of revenue, so they no longer need, they're growing on their own, not necessarily high growth, but they're growing on their own and don't need any more money. It's not unlikely to see that company having burned through $20, $30 million, $40 million to get to that kind of run rate. Now, at that point, they continue to grow. They continue to build their business. Maybe they need to go back to the investor community at that point, to private equity, to get enough of a bankroll to begin acquiring disruptive technology relevant to their business. And that changes the model a little bit. The dynamics shift a bit. But I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know, for example, how much money SourceFire burned through until they got profitable and managed to have an IPO, and then, of course, their exit post-IPO to Cisco. I don't have those statistics for FireEye either. I don't know how much money, for example, went to FireEye until they managed to go to the public market and raise $300 million in crazy valuation of at 1.6 or $7 billion. So I don't have those numbers directly, but generally I think the finger in wind for an enterprise security company could very easily be in the $20 to $30 million of investment money to get to revenue positive.
And Ron, with that, I think we'll end the webinar. We went over a little bit, but it was very informative. Ron Moritz, thank you very much for your participation tonight.
It was a pleasure, and thank you everybody for participating. And I think the slides will be available. On the last slide is my contact information, and you're welcome to reach out.
Thank you, everybody. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we will make these slides available. Ron has given us permission to do that. Any questions that may come up as you review them, please, you can send them over. I'm pretty sure Ron would be happy and enjoy sort of conversing with people in the industry. Thank you again for your participation. This was this was a great event. And if you have suggestions for further events that you would find valuable, let us know. And with that, this is Zack Miller at OurCrowd signing off. Have a good evening, everybody.